Hello and welcome. I'm Steve Clemens, editor-at-large of The Hill. Thanks for joining us for today's event. We call it America's Unfinished Business, an LGBTQ plus summit. June is Pride Month, and today we're going to be exploring the impacts of hard-fought wins and the road still ahead for some of the issues most affecting LGBTQ communities across the country and, frankly, across the world. We've got a spectacular lineup of speakers joining us this afternoon, but before we begin, we'd like to thank our sponsors, Capital One and Philip Morris International, for their support of today's conversations. Recent years have unquestionably seen advancements in rights and protections for LGBTQ plus Americans, from marriage equality to last June's landmark Supreme Court decision preventing employers from firing LGBTQ plus identifying employees on the basis of sexual orientation or gender identity. But there's so much more work to be done. Even as the Equality Act clears the House and heads to the Senate for a vote, hundreds of anti-LGBT bills have been introduced in state legislatures this year. What then is the outlook for LGBTQ plus protections at the federal and state levels? And what additional advancements in visibility and representation should we be seeking? We're going to be putting these questions and many more in front of our fantastic lineup of speakers. But first, a few housekeeping notes. You can tweet us at The Hill Events using the hashtag #TheHillLGBTQ. I wish we had a plus there, but we'll just go The Hill LGBTQ. We're broadcasting live, and we'll take your questions throughout the program. And as with any live stream, it could go haywire. Just push refresh, and they say it will fix everything. Never does for me, but I'm sure it will for you. My first guest is Congressman Ritchie Torres from New York. He made history as the first gay Afro-Latino person elected to Congress, and he now chairs the Congressional LGBTQ plus Equality Caucus. Congressman Torres, great to talk to you, and thank you for joining us. Let me just tell our audience a little bit about the district in the Bronx you come. I did not know that it was the poorest district in terms of income in the United States. And for you to have achieved the things you did, I mean, I've been reading up all about the struggles you've dealt with. $100 million golf course created across the street from where you lived when you didn't have dependable water, heat, etc. I just want to know, and I want to and you add your identity on top of that. And so it's kind of a success story in a weird way. But as you hear other people struggling with circumstances they're in, and they may be struggling with their LGBTQ plus identity, what kind of counsel would you give them?
Well, I would tell them you have to be who you are. I see coming out as a gift, because the process of coming out, the integrity that it demands from you, is an ethic of radical authenticity. And those of us who have chosen to come out, who have chosen to be who we are living life with greater authenticity and integrity, which not only matters when it comes to your sexuality, but it matters when it comes to the fullness of your overall life. As you said, I was born and raised in the Bronx. Nothing was ever handed to me on a silver platter. I had to fight for everything I have in my life. I was raised by a single mother who had to raise 3 children on minimum wage, which in the 1990s was a mere $4.25. And I grew up in molded and leaking conditions in public housing. And as you referenced, my life is something of a metaphor. I actually grew up in a public housing development right across the street from what ultimately became Trump Golf Course. And as I saw the conditions in my own home get worse every day, the government had invested more than $100 million in a golf course for Donald Trump. And I remember asking myself at the time, what does it say about our society that we're willing to invest more in a golf course than in the homes of low-income Black and brown New Yorkers in public housing? And so that experience of inequality in the shadow of Trump Golf Course is what inspired me to get my start in politics as a housing organizer.
I appreciate that. And, one of the areas we're going to be talking a lot about today is that while there have been achievements, while the Equality Act has passed in the House, we see this rise of basically, in my book, bigoted legislation, efforts around the United States to, curb transgendered rights. We also see an absolutely alarming increase in the rise of the highest level of deaths against transgendered and non-binary people in our history this past year. And yesterday we did a program with The Hill on mental health and COVID. But one of the things we talked about, the Trevor Project found that 40% of young LGBTQ plus students have thought about suicide. And so you just sort of feel the stress and tension there on all those fronts. And I'm just wondering, and I know it's unfair, but as you look at the LGBTQ plus caucus, which you help co-chair, what's on their agenda that really matters? I mean, we have bright colors behind us, but they're not bright colors in a lot of people's lives. So I'm just sort of interested in as you look at it as a legislator now, what do we need to be aware of in terms of rectifying and helping some of these people that are dying?
Well, the highest priority of the LGBTQ caucus, the holy grail of LGBTQ equality, it is the Equality Act. So the Equality Act would expand the scope of the Civil Rights Act to protect the LGBTQ community from discrimination. The Equality Act is based on a simple proposition that no one should be fired or evicted or denied critical services or accommodations simply because of who you are or whom you love. Everyone is entitled to equal protection under the law, regardless of your sexual orientation and gender identity. Back in 2015 in New York State, we had a statewide lobby for the LGBTQ community known as the Empire State Pride Agenda. And in December of 2015, several months following the Obergefell decision, the lobby chose to close shop, declaring that its mission had been accomplished. And that press release was met with a ferocious backlash. And for me, that demonstrates that we have to be careful in a post-Obergefell world not to prematurely declare mission accomplished, not to take for granted the inevitability of progress. We have to recognize that marriage equality is only one component of legal equality, and legal equality is only one component of LGBTQ equality, overall LGBTQ equality. Even if we were to pass the Equality Act, there will continue to be LGBTQ elders who face among the highest rates of isolation and depression. There will continue to be LGBTQ youth who are bullied at school by their own peers, who are evicted from their homes by their own parents. And LGBTQ youth face disproportionately high rates of housing insecurity and homelessness, suicidal ideation, and suicide. As you noted, the Human Rights Campaign has reported the highest number of murders against members of the trans community, particularly trans people of color, in the history of the organization. So we have to be careful not to declare mission accomplished and to make progress on all these fronts.
Do you find, we're going to be talking to some folks that have been doing some bipartisan work, but as you're up in Congress now, and you've succeeded, so significantly, I think there are now 9 LGBTQ plus members in the House. But how is it going with Republican colleagues? Are you finding common ground with them, both on these sort of Equality Act issues in any way, but on other issues? I saw you in your Twitter feed with President Biden about the child tax credit and various things. Sometimes these human moments, whether it's on mental health or dealing with COVID crisis or something, create opportunities for folks across the aisle to find, that they're both human on each side of this. And has that helped on any of the LGBTQ plus efforts as far as you've seen in the House?
Quite the contrary. What I've seen is Republicans are doubling down on the culture wars. I vividly remember the Republican Party under George W. Bush running in 2004 on a platform of opposing marriage equality through various referenda across the country. And I feel like we're witnessing a revival of those culture wars. The difference between then and now is that the new culture wars are specifically targeting the trans community, right? Since transphobia remains more socially acceptable than homophobia, the Republicans are waging a cynical campaign of scapegoating and spear-mongering that specifically demonizes the trans community. I've heard Republicans in Congress portray the Equality Act as an existential threat to womanhood, to female athletics, to religious liberty. Republicans falsely claiming that if we pass the Equality Act, it's going to lead to rapes and assaults in bathrooms. So if anything, the rhetoric of Republicans have become much more transphobic, much more hyperbolic, much more vitriolic. Instead of progressing, the Republican Party is doubling down on transphobia.
You were the youngest member of the New York City Council. You're one of the youngest people in there. I was happy to be at a Pride event last night with Congresswoman Lauren Underwood, who was there to show her support and come in. And she's also one of the youngest members of the House today. And I'm just wondering, I mean, just kind of get inside, you know, Gen Zers and millennials' heads as they're kind of looking at this scene. Are you folks hopeful with what's going on? Are you frustrated with the way the legislative process works and the kind of deal making it takes and the stalls that you see in places in the Senate? I'm just interested because I've known generations of senators and House members a long time, and I just love to kind of get in your head for a minute and see what, you know, how it all looks to you folks. Congresswoman Underwood is very, very positive, doing a lot on health care, child credit, very supportive LGBTQ plus community. But I'm interested in whether the process itself to you seems healthy or broken.
Look, I'm optimistic out of necessity, right? You know, there would be no reason for me to serve in Congress unless I thought I could make a difference, unless I thought I could have an impact in improving people's lives. Having said that, our democracy is broken. You know, in a properly functioning democracy, policies that have the support of the majority of the American people, that have the support of the president, that have the support of legislative majorities in the Senate and the House, would become law. But what we have is nothing resembling a functioning democracy. We live under the tyranny of the filibuster. The filibuster has made the Senate a graveyard for vital legislation such as the Equality Act. And that is the greatest source of frustration, is there's no real ability to govern boldly, largely because of the obstructionism that the filibuster represents. And you know, there are those who attempt to advance a romanticized vision of the filibuster as the best hope for bipartisanship. There is no evidence that the filibuster has given us bipartisanship. Quite the opposite. It's given us nothing but glorified gridlock. And if we want to start governing more effectively in the service of LGBTQ equality, we have to either reform or abolish altogether the filibuster.
Oh, fascinating. I guess, you know, I just ask, you know, one other thing is you kind of look at the heat we've gone through. So we're coming out, it seems, of the most intense parts of the pandemic. We have, you know, we saw what happened in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder and, frankly, the murder of many other Black and brown Americans. We're talking about the death of many transgender citizens in this country. And I have to say, I mean, this is my own editorial comment, I wonder and I fear if we're going to lose not make the progress we should have made in these intense moments on dealing with racial bigotry, on dealing with homophobic bigotry and other sorts of divides. You know, that we had a kind of moment where this was all we talked about and we saw that tension. And I'm just wondering, do you think we have the momentum in Congress? Do you have the momentum in your caucus to keep the priority of civil rights and justice high and not just a function of an incident that happened? Because I feel it's slipping. I'm not sure what you think.
Look, we should hope for the best, but prepare for the worst. And I think you have every right to be vigilant. But there's no question that we're progressing. And, you know, one example is the Supreme Court's decision in the Bostock case, which was ironically written by Neil Gorsuch. But the Supreme Court held that Title VII's prohibition against employment discrimination based on sex applies to sexual identity and gender, sexual orientation and gender identity. The Supreme Court pointed out the obvious, that you cannot discriminate based on sex without discriminating. So you cannot discriminate based on sexual orientation or gender identity without inherently discriminating based on sex. And so the Biden administration has applied the revolutionary logic of the Bostock decision to enact a whole panoply of administrative rules prohibiting discrimination based on sexual orientation and gender identity. So there is a Bostock revolution unfolding as we speak. And that to me represents a real breakthrough for LGBTQ equality. It's no substitute for the Equality Act, but it's a bona fide breakthrough.
Well, Representative Ritchie Torres of New York, I assume your mom is still with us. Your mom, I just following your story, the tweets, your mom sounds like an incredible lady. Would love to interview her and get her on this show one day, just sounds like you've just really done incredible things already at a very young point in your life. So Representative Ritchie Torres, thank you so much, co-chair of the Congressional LGBTQ+ Equality Caucus. Thanks for joining us today.
Take care.